you're better off to cart them away and put them to some use than to have them shot. And the only way to do that is to put them through a little bit. If they're a bit stubborn to load, well, so be it. We've saved them.
Picture yourself standing in the middle of Australia's endless desert. The sun hammers down with brutal intensity. The horizon stretches in every direction without relief. The landscape looks utterly impassable, hostile to anything trying to cross it. Back in the 1800s, this wasn't just an intimidating view. It was a genuine survival problem for settlers and explorers attempting to push inland. They needed a solution, and they needed it fast. So they made what seemed like a brilliant decision at the time. They brought in donkeys. At first, it looked like genius. Donkeys proved dependable, incredibly tough, and surprisingly adaptable to the harsh conditions. Soon, these humble animals became absolutely vital for survival in the outback. But over time, something nobody anticipated started happening. That seemingly brilliant solution began creating consequences that Australia is still desperately trying to fix today. What started as a practical transportation answer transformed into an ecological nightmare that would take over a century to understand and longer still to control. To understand exactly how donkeys ended up reshaping Australia's landscape, we need to rewind to the mid-1800s. Settlers were still struggling violently with the harsh inland environment. Horses and oxen were being used, but both had serious limitations in such brutal conditions. Camels would eventually be imported and prove valuable, but that widespread adoption didn't happen until decades later. So settlers looked for another animal capable of handling extreme desert conditions without breaking down. That's when donkeys entered the picture. Imported from various international sources, these animals quickly demonstrated they were hardy, patient, and surprisingly strong for their relatively small size. They were soon recognized as a cheaper and more reliable alternative to horses. The advantages were obvious. Donkeys didn't need lush pastures of grass. They consumed significantly less water than horses. They could survive on vegetation that other animals ignored completely. For working in Australia's punishing outback conditions, they seemed almost perfectly designed. Initially, there weren't many of them. The first substantial imports arrived somewhere between the 1820s and 1840s. Not long after, as gold rush towns exploded and inland cattle stations popped up across the territory, demand for donkeys began rising rapidly. People used them to haul heavy supplies, carry mining equipment, and transport precious water barrels across impossibly long distances. Little by little, donkeys became increasingly common throughout the interior. Over time, their reputation grew among settlers and pastoralists. Yes, they were slower than horses, but they also rarely broke down or gave up. Settlers discovered that a team of donkeys could keep walking steadily even when other animals collapsed from exhaustion or dehydration. That reliability proved worth far more than speed when you're in the middle of a desert that could kill you. When many pastoralists and ranchers realized this fundamental truth, they began breeding donkeys locally rather than paying expensive import costs for new animals from overseas. Here's where the problem quietly began taking root. Because donkeys could survive in almost any environment with minimal care, they were often turned loose once settlers no longer needed them. Sometimes miners simply abandoned them when gold fields dried up and closed. Other times cattlemen released them after seasonal work ended, and they no longer wanted to feed extra animals through the off-season. Occasionally, these resilient creatures even escaped on their own. By the late 1800s, donkeys in Australia were still mostly used as working pack animals, but the seeds for them becoming a much bigger ecological problem were already being planted across the outback, completely unnoticed. Before we explore how that problem exploded, we need to understand exactly why donkeys survived so successfully in the Australian wild when other animals struggled. Remember that critical advantage. They didn't need much water. Donkeys can go extended periods without drinking, far longer than horses or cattle. They graze happily on dry shrubs, tough desert grasses, and thorny vegetation that other livestock completely ignore. This allowed them to thrive in the same brutal desert environments where cattle struggled desperately to survive. Another factor that helped enormously, the donkeys that escaped or were deliberately abandoned quickly formed small herds. These social groups moved steadily into increasingly remote areas, especially throughout Western Australia and the Northern Territory. Unlike cattle or sheep, which needed humans to guide, manage, and protect them, donkeys spread independently. They walked incredible distances while foraging as they traveled, quickly colonizing new territory without any human assistance whatsoever. That independence, combined with increasingly careless human behavior, became a massive factor in their spread and eventual domination as the primary feral animal across Australia's desert regions. During the early 1900s, as motor vehicles and expanding rail lines revolutionized transportation, settlers stopped relying heavily on animal transport. Camels and donkeys were gradually replaced by trucks and trains. Rather than keep these animals penned and continue feeding them, many owners simply released them into the wild. After all, why spend money caring for animals that were no longer economically useful? The logic seemed sound at the time, but the consequences would prove catastrophic. Sightings of wild donkey herds began appearing as early as the 1900s. By mid-century, reports of feral donkey populations became increasingly widespread and concerning. Farmers spotted them drinking at remote watering holes. Rangers noticed them traveling in organized groups across desert tracts. Station owners saw them on the horizon in areas where livestock had never ventured. These donkeys weren't just surviving against the odds. They were actively spreading into areas where people never expected to find them. Donkeys possess remarkable physical capabilities that aided their expansion. They can climb rocky ridges that stop cattle. They squeeze through dense scrub that blocks horses. They trek enormous distances without tiring. That exceptional mobility meant they weren't confined to one small corner of the desert where people had released them. Instead, they expanded aggressively into the Kimberley region, throughout parts of the Pilbara, and deep into the vast northern territory. Under normal circumstances, a few feral donkeys wandering around wouldn't constitute a serious problem. But there was another issue that nobody had properly considered. Their numbers kept increasing at an alarming rate. Donkeys reproduced steadily under favorable conditions, and Australia's interior provided surprisingly favorable conditions for them. Unlike other large livestock animals, adult donkeys faced almost no natural predators. Yes, dingoes occasionally attacked foals or weak individuals, but healthy adult donkeys were rarely threatened by anything in the Australian ecosystem. That meant their populations weren't naturally checked by predation the way they would be in their native habitats, and the situation was rapidly becoming genuinely concerning. By 1949, wild donkey numbers had grown so explosively high throughout Western Australia that the government officially declared them a pest species. Their growing populations were beginning to add severe pressure to an already fragile desert ecosystem. By the time feral donkey numbers reached the hundreds of thousands, the environmental damage they caused became impossible to ignore. Australia's desert and savanna landscapes are ecologically fragile in ways most people don't understand. Waterholes, native grasses, and dry season pastures barely support the native animals that evolved specifically to survive there over millions of years. Throwing massive feral donkey herds into this delicate mix placed enormous strain on already stressed ecosystems. The first and most obvious issue was grazing pressure. Donkeys eat an extraordinarily wide range of plants and grasses that cattle and sheep typically overlook. At first glance, this dietary flexibility might sound beneficial, but left unchecked across hundreds of thousands of animals, it quickly becomes catastrophic. Donkeys were consuming the same vegetation that native wildlife species relied upon during tough dry seasons. As a result, kangaroos, wallabies, and native herbivores faced dramatically increased competition for food. Many native species began declining in regions where donkey populations exploded. Water presented another critical problem. In arid parts of Australia, permanent water holes are extremely rare and ecologically vital. Donkeys often descended on these precious watering spots in massive numbers. They trampled the fragile edges, turned clear water into muddy soup, and occupied the sites for extended periods. Smaller native animals avoided water holes when they became overrun with aggressive donkey herds. For pastoralists trying to run cattle stations, this meant their livestock also struggled to access clean water. Over time, the constant heavy trampling damaged fragile soil surrounding these water points, causing severe erosion that could take decades to heal naturally. Donkeys also directly impacted the physical structure of the landscape itself. Their hard hooves compacted soil as they moved across vast distances in large herds. This compaction dramatically reduced the soil's ability to absorb rainfall. In the dry outback, where literally every drop of water matters for survival, this change worsened drought effects and made the landscape even less forgiving for all species. Infrastructure damage became another constant complaint from landowners. Donkeys broke through fences, especially when searching for water or food on the other side. In some cases, entire donkey herds destroyed water troughs and tanks simply by crowding around them in massive numbers. This proved terrible news for remote landowners already dealing with countless other challenges of outback life. The destructive effects of uncontrolled donkey populations added yet another expensive challenge to their operations. There was also the significant question of disease transmission. Donkeys, like all livestock, can carry and spread various parasites and illnesses. Although Australia works extremely hard to control diseases affecting horses and cattle, the presence of large unmanaged donkey herds created serious monitoring concerns. Wild donkeys moving freely across vast ranges were virtually impossible to monitor for diseases or treat for parasites, and there remained one more critical problem: the issue of biodiversity loss. Donkeys were moving into delicate habitats that had never experienced hoofed animals before European settlement. Wetlands, rocky ridges, and rare desert springs all felt the destructive impact. Over time, ecologists raised increasingly urgent alarms. They warned that native plant species were disappearing faster than they could regenerate. The situation deteriorated so severely in some regions that rare vegetation communities faced permanent alteration or complete destruction. By the time the 20th century progressed, scientists and policymakers could no longer dismiss or ignore the escalating problem. Donkeys were fundamentally reshaping Australia's ecological landscape, and definitely not in positive ways. Donkey numbers had exploded catastrophically across northern Australia, and the environmental pressure they generated was undeniable. Landowners were struggling financially and physically. Government agencies were increasingly worried. Conservation groups were speaking up loudly. Everyone could clearly see that something drastic had to change. But the question remained: how exactly do you manage hundreds of thousands of wild animals scattered across Australia's vast remote desert regions? Initial efforts to control exploding donkey populations weren't particularly sophisticated or organized. They were small-scale and localized. Individual station owners tried shooting donkeys near waterholes or setting up traps to capture them. These methods did remove some animals, but they barely made a noticeable dent in the overall population. Donkeys are intelligent and naturally wary animals. If hunting pressure intensified in one area, they simply relocated elsewhere. The desert provided endless places to disappear. By the mid-20th century, larger-scale coordinated programs finally began. Government agencies started organizing aerial culls, which became one of the most effective approaches. Helicopter shooting emerged as the most common method for accessing remote populations. Pilots flew over isolated desert regions while trained marksmen targeted herds from above. It was extremely expensive, but it allowed authorities to access places almost impossible to reach by ground vehicles. For desperate pastoralists whose fences and precious water infrastructure were being destroyed, aerial culling provided welcome relief. Still, helicopters could only cover limited territory, and the donkey numbers seemed endless. That limitation led to one of the most ambitious and innovative projects in wildlife pest management, the Judas donkey method. The concept was elegantly simple yet remarkably effective. Wildlife managers would capture a wild donkey, fit it with a radio tracking collar, and release it back into the wild. Because donkeys are inherently social animals, the collared individual would naturally seek out and rejoin other donkeys. Once it located and joined a herd, trackers could follow the radio signal directly to the entire group's location. This system allowed marksmen to efficiently remove large numbers at once instead of wastefully chasing scattered individuals across endless desert landscapes. The Judas program proved remarkably effective in practice. It was initially tested in the Northern Territory during the 1980s with impressive results. It also worked exceptionally well in challenging regions like the Kimberley in subsequent years. Over time, this innovative technique became a crucial tool for reducing donkey numbers to more manageable levels. In fact, many other countries dealing with similar invasive species problems later borrowed this same methodology for controlling feral goats, pigs, and other pest animals. The Australian innovation spread globally. Despite these documented successes, completely eliminating all feral donkeys still seemed impossible. Australia is simply too vast, with countless remote areas where animals can hide indefinitely. Instead, the management focus gradually shifted toward ongoing control rather than total eradication. The goal became finding sustainable ways to keep donkey populations sufficiently low that they'd stop causing severe environmental damage and destroying expensive rural infrastructure. The financial cost, however, remained substantial. Aerial culls, radio collaring programs, and coordinated ground operations required consistent funding, careful coordination, and dedicated manpower. For cash-strapped government agencies and isolated landholders operating on tight margins, sustaining expensive long-term campaigns proved constantly challenging. This meant donkey populations often rebounded significantly whenever control efforts slowed or funding dried up. Another complicating layer emerged from ethical debates. Animal welfare organizations raised serious concerns about aerial shooting and large-scale culling operations. They worried extensively about animal suffering caused by these control methods, sometimes launching public campaigns against them. Those supporting aggressive control measures countered these arguments forcefully. They insisted that the severe environmental and agricultural costs of unchecked donkey populations far outweighed concerns about individual animal welfare. The debate continues today. Even with ongoing challenges and controversies, the results in targeted regions were genuinely noticeable. In some areas, donkey numbers dropped dramatically through sustained control efforts. Water holes gradually recovered their ecological health. Native vegetation had opportunities to regrow without constant grazing pressure. Livestock operations gained easier access to critical water resources. But in other less accessible or lower priority regions, donkeys continued thriving with minimal interference. This geographic patchwork served as a stark reminder that the issue remained far from solved. Since these animals are so remarkably resilient and independent, even a small migration of just a few breeding herds could quickly repopulate areas where numbers had been reduced, restarting the destructive cycle. By the 2000s, feral donkey management had become an established, ongoing component of Australia's broader fight against numerous invasive species, alongside camels, wild horses, feral pigs, and invasive cats. Australia's complex donkey story continues evolving today. Feral donkeys remain distributed across enormous areas of northern and central Australia, while their numbers dropped significantly in some well-managed regions through sustained control efforts. Populations remain stubbornly strong in other areas, especially rugged or less accessible landscapes that helicopters struggle to reach. The current question isn't whether donkeys are completely gone, because they're not. It's about how to keep populations continuously in check without endlessly repeating expensive control cycles. Yet even after decades of dedicated management efforts, several modern challenges persist stubbornly. Cost remains a primary obstacle. Large-scale aerial culling campaigns, sophisticated Judas donkey tracking programs, and labor-intensive ground-based shooting operations all demand steady, reliable funding. But government budgets allocated to managing invasive species are perpetually limited. Donkeys aren't the only problematic animals causing environmental and economic headaches across Australia. Control programs for camels, wild horses, feral pigs, and invasive cats all compete for the same limited funding pools. This means donkey control often gets scaled back once populations reach temporarily manageable levels. Unfortunately, when management pressure relaxes even slightly, breeding herds can rebound surprisingly quickly. People are increasingly understanding how donkey management connects to larger environmental conservation goals. When donkey pressure at critical waterholes reduces, native species populations get genuine opportunities to recover and thrive. Similarly, reducing donkey grazing pressure helps protect crucial vegetation cover. This matters enormously because healthy plant cover prevents catastrophic soil erosion and directly supports diverse local wildlife communities. The donkey issue isn't merely about the animals themselves. It ties directly into Australia's larger goal of protecting unique ecosystems found nowhere else on Earth. Geography presents another formidable challenge. Australia's outback is absolutely massive, and continuously monitoring every remote corner remains virtually impossible with limited resources and personnel. There's also the persistent challenge of public perception, which complicates management decisions. To some people, feral donkeys represent destructive invasive pests that harm irreplaceable fragile ecosystems and cost landowners substantial money. To others, donkeys represent an important part of Australia's cultural heritage and frontier history. They remember how these animals once helped pioneers survive impossible journeys and haul heavy loads across unforgiving terrain. Some animal rights organizations focus primarily on donkey welfare, arguing these animals shouldn't face harsh culling or rough removal methods regardless of environmental impact. Because of these fundamentally different perspectives, virtually every new control plan tends to spark heated arguments and social tension. Meanwhile, researchers and land managers are continuously testing different innovative approaches. New technology is gradually shifting how control efforts are planned and executed. Improved GPS tracking collars, aerial drones, and satellite monitoring now make it considerably easier to track herds across extremely difficult terrain. Some experimental programs are testing fertility control methods as more humane alternatives. However, applying contraceptive treatments to animals scattered across vast distances remains an enormous logistical challenge that hasn't been solved. Looking realistically ahead, most experts agree on one fundamental point: totally eradicating Australia's feral donkeys simply isn't possible. The country is too geographically vast, and the donkeys are too widespread to eliminate completely. The more practical approach focuses on continuous long-term population management, keeping numbers persistently low, and maintaining rapid response control programs ready when populations inevitably surge again. Australia has developed some of the world's most innovative pest control techniques, including the internationally recognized Judas tracking method. But maintaining these sophisticated programs requires consistent funding, sustained political will, and continued public support, all of which fluctuate unpredictably. Donkeys will likely never completely disappear from Australia's deserts and rangelands, but their environmental impact can be substantially shaped and reduced through intelligent, sustained management. The question is whether Australia can maintain that commitment across the decades it will require. What makes you think about Australia's approach to this complex ecological challenge? The story of how a practical solution became an environmental crisis offers lessons about unintended consequences that extend far beyond one country's borders.